Welcome to CPAC Now, America UnCanceled, special edition here, pre-CPAC Japan, as Matt and I are both heading out to Tokyo. And joining us to talk about basically everything that you're seeing happening on the international scale is a CPAC board member, friend of the Schlaps, and author of the newly released China is Going to War, Gordon Chang. Gordon, thank you for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Mercy. Thank you, Matt.
Okay, so before we get on this very long plane ride, give a teaser to our listeners and watchers about what's going on with Japan and why is it so important for CPAC to be in Tokyo?
Well, Japan is the cornerstone ally of the U.S. in the region. It is important when you look at a map, and really what it is our best ally up there. So it's important that Americans and Japanese work together. That's not always been the case. It has been for the last couple administrations, so that's good. The big thing right now is that China, Japan, and South Korea just wrapped up a trilateral meeting. The Chinese, as they are arrogant, sort of gave a difficult time to both Seoul and Tokyo. But the more important thing from our perspective is that Japan and South Korea are now working very closely together because we have a military alliance with South Korea. We have a military alliance with Japan, but Japan and South Korea are not military allies. And oftentimes they don't really like each other and treat each other as an enemy. And what we have been trying to do over the course of administrations is to get them to work together. And finally, that is bearing some fruit.
Well, and then when you're looking at Japan and the fact, for example, that you've seen North Korea be relatively aggressive against Japan by launching these test missiles. You mentioned also that North Korea has launched a spy satellite. Walk us through about not only is North Korea a threat to the United States, but also to our allies like Japan.
Well, for one thing, North Korea actually has a missile, the Hwasong-17, that can hit any part of the United States. We know they have nuclear weapons. What we don't know is whether they can mate those weapons to those missiles, but they probably are getting the technology from Russia or China. So if they can't do it today, they certainly will be able to do it in a few years to hit the U.S. with a nuke. But we also know that China and Russia have been fueling North Korea in various ways. For instance, North Korea's economy is only there because of support from Beijing and Moscow. And so if there is war in East Asia, we have to assume that North Korea is going to attack South Korea or hit Japan with missiles or something. This is going to be an all-out, all-front war.
Okay, so Gordon, when we leave Tokyo and come back to the United States of America, what will be success in your view with our important conference, CPAC in Tokyo?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really what this is a continuing conversation on all levels between Washington and Tokyo. And so it's important that people in Japan, not necessarily in the government, see Americans, ordinary Americans like us, come to their country and support them. And that will be a message which will resonate throughout Japan. This is something, of course, which is more than just one visit, but it is absolutely critical that we continue this. And so therefore, it is important, for instance, that we go to the CPAC in Japan and that people in Japan come to our CPAC so that these bonds are enriched and nourished over time.
And Matt, you've obviously worked very closely with Jay over at the Japanese Conservative Union. So I also want to get your sense of what is, as you've gone, this is what number CPAC in Japan?
I don't like the quizzes, Gordon. I never know the answer.
Well,
probably it's like 5 or 6.
Right. So there is a reason that this relationship keeps strengthening. Why do you think that is?
Obviously I listen to what Gordon talks about, the importance of having an anchor or kind of a cornerstone ally in an area. I think it's interesting that our CPACs have really ended up being in the right countries.
Yeah.
And I can't say that it's always because we had the perfect, idea of where to go, but the other countries know that they need this as well. So like I think Hungary is the right country in Europe. People can quibble with different things about what's going on in Hungary, but you can't quibble that they are the aggressive pushback on the EU, which is another form of what the UN tries to do, this kind of a globalism where they break down the idea of the nation state. And I think Japan is that country in the neighborhood that Gordon just described. And I think Brazil is definitely the right country in South America, but now Argentina seems to be part of that conversation as well. And then Mexico was the right country. And how do you know? Because Gordon, you know this, that when we've gone to all of these events in Tokyo, and Lydia, your wife, knows this as well, which is everybody comes. It's like a magnet. So everybody in the area comes to it. That's how you know you've chosen wisely, because people understand that Tokyo is an important capital where people who believe in freedom and free markets want to meet.
So, Gordon, question to you. The ambassador, Rahm Emanuel, U.S. ambassador to Japan, obviously they're pushing these very radicalized agenda into Japan, including the whole LGBTQ agenda. And conservatives there in Japan seem to really not like this sort of American intervention of these radical ideologies. What's your sense?
Yeah, and this is not just Japan. This is every country. And we are losing friends, for instance, in a socially conservative Africa because of this. There are far more important issues in the world right now. And for them in the Biden administration to concentrate on these types of issues is just astounding. I mean, it is incredibly destructive. And we have seen this from country to country.
Yeah, I can't agree more with Gordon. When you go as the American ambassador to a key ally, you're there to build the bonds of relationship, to talk about the strategic partnership, not to push the most radical societal kind of experimentation that we have in our public school classrooms and jam it into these countries. It's really offensive. And the people of Japan, they have their own approach on these sets of issues that he's pushing, including gender confusion and these other things. And it looks like a reinstatement of imperialism. And the left are the new imperialists. It's kind of insane.
Let me ask you, Gordon, real quick. You've tweeted about this. There's a war against Israel because China, among other things, is financing Iran and supplying arms to Iran's military proxies such as Hamas. You talk about this. You're such an expert in this area of China. In terms of this, the support of Iran, is it something that has been coming years back? When did they really solidify this relationship between China and Iran?
Yeah, this relationship between Tehran and Beijing, it goes back decades. So, for instance, Iran has a uranium enrichment program, which really means it has a nuclear weapons program because of China. They have Chinese technology, and China made sure that Iran got it through the black market ring of AQ Khan of Pakistan, which has spread nuclear weapons technology throughout the region. But right now we see Chinese diplomats provide support for Hamas, propaganda support, weapons, as you mentioned. But all of this is backed by a commercial relationship, which gives Iran the ability to support these militant groups. So, for instance, in the first 9 months of this year, China's purchases of Iranian oil was 60% above that in the comparable period in 2017. 2017 is important because that was the last year before the Trump administration imposed or reimposed sanctions on the purchase of Iranian oil. So that shows you that this war is there because of Chinese support of Iran.
That is such a great question and such a troublesome idea what's going on in the Middle East. Gordon, as we go to Asia and other parts of the world, how uniquely kind of problematic is what's going on in the Middle East? It seemed like America was so, at least the left and some of the right, were so focused on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You can't find a mention of it on Twitter or in the news. It's almost like it went away. Is it because what's going on in Israel this is actually so much more serious, or how do you equate this?
Well, part of it is because the atrocities that Hamas has been committing. And this has, of course, grabbed people's attention. But right now, the world is aflame. You've got the war in Ukraine. You've got insurgencies across North Africa that look like wars, and China and Russia are fueling those. And of course, the war against Israel. There's a number of conflicts that are brewing right now. Basically, it's a breakdown of order around the world. And this is no less than perhaps the beginning of the world's third global conflict. Got to remember that World War II didn't start with one big bang. There were a lot of separate wars that merged into what historians now call World War II. And what we're seeing right now is the same thing. You see China and Russia fueling these insurgencies and wars, and these could very well merge into the Third World War.
So I got to ask you, because I follow your Twitter very closely. Sorry, sweetie. I think I follow Gordon's more than I follow yours.
I know, because you read them out aloud to me every morning.
And I've noticed a shift. You always talked about policy. You were very focused on policy on the China front. And I've noticed that there's a lot of, we got to pray. We got to pray. Like, evil is out there. We got to ask God to be merciful. And I feel the same way. Whenever, as we've really committed ourselves to our faith, understand that things are very fragile right now. You mentioned that the world is aflame. What drew you to start really being more vocal about your faith and the importance of prayer during this time?
I guess it's because, I've never been a particularly religious person. I've always been a believer. But what is, as I see the world, as I see evil on the march, it has made me focus on how do you defend yourself against evil? And I believe that it is faith, because faith draws people together. Faith draws the best out of people. And as you read the Bible, there are so many parallels with what is going on today to what has occurred so many, 2 millennia ago or more. So that has been the factor that has made me rediscover faith and view it in a different light.
I also think, Gordon, that watching America go through these insane Biden policies, having to live through them, including the open southern border, I feel like it triggered something in you, because you understand well that when you just say anybody can come, our enemies use that against us. They use our freedoms against us, and that must chafe you to see that.
Yeah, we talk about, I talked about war elsewhere, but there will be war on American soil if things get worse. And the reason is they've been flooding operatives and saboteurs into our country across that open southern border. And it's Chinese, it is Syrians, Venezuelans, some very scary characters. There's a couple of Americans down there who've been watching this. One of them is Michael Yon, the war correspondent, whom you know.
Yeah.
Also, the Rubin brothers, and they've been chronicling this just march of very dangerous types through South and Central America to our open southern border, and they have been sounding the warning of what's going to happen. So on the first day of the war, we're going to see this. China's been putting, for instance, the infrastructure to attack us from our own soil. That was that lab in Reedley, California, near Fresno, which had, according to the official count, at least 20 pathogens, including Ebola, and almost 1,000 mice that had been genetically engineered to spread disease. So we know what's coming, and the Biden administration is just allowing these very dangerous individuals into our country and not monitoring them.
So when we're talking about, with your book, China is going to war, is it not only from the military standpoint, but you're also saying from the biological warfare standpoint? Is that, talk to us about, when you were really researching and doing this book, writing this book, what was one of the more shocking findings that you've had?
Well, the shocking finding is that we're not defending ourselves.
Yeah.
We've got an administration in Washington. China has, the Communist Party is a militant state. So what they do, just doesn't really surprise me that much. Though I have to say that when you start looking at, for instance, COVID, And I know COVID's sort of an old story, but we're hearing more about people in our government covering for China. Dr. Fauci, for instance, was determined to hide China's involvement in COVID-19. We don't know 100% where SARS-CoV-2, the pathogen that caused this disease, but we do know a couple things. One of them is that at a critical period, December 2019, January 2020, the Chinese regime lied about the transmissibility of COVID-19. They knew it was highly contagious. They told the Trump administration and others that it was not. And while they were locking down their own country, and lockdowns are controversial, but by locking down their own country, they were telling the world they thought this was an effective way to spread disease. So while these guys were locking down their own country, they were pressuring the Trump administration and others to take arrivals from China without restrictions. So they deliberately spread this disease. That's 1.1 million Americans who perished from a disease. Now, we can argue about the number of people who have died from COVID as opposed to something else, but the point is anything more than zero is completely unacceptable. And right now, we have an administration in Washington that doesn't ask China anything at all about the origins of this disease.
And the next one. So we're already reading accounts of this new virus that can impact children. I'm sure you're reading about it as well, Gordon. Will America act differently? We have a new president, of course. I think it's a demotion, by the way. But we have a new president. Will the world and America act differently if a new virus comes running out of China?
Yeah, I suppose so. I don't know. I mean, what we're seeing in China right now, they say is not a new pathogen. But of course, we can't trust the Chinese because they have consistently lied about COVID and other diseases. But until we know the truth, we should be shutting down our borders to arrivals from China or people who have been in China, for instance, in the last couple of weeks. Biden administration won't do anything. So right now, we have an administration that is determined not to protect the American people from disease.
Well, it's very interesting, Mercy, because if the only way we can get that southern border closed is because there's a virus panic going on, it's interesting to see how Biden will respond.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see. Real quick, before we close here, in terms of the Biden administration, obviously we saw that he met with the Chinese president. We've seen Governor Gavin Newsom meet with the Chinese president. We saw these American company corporate leaders meeting with the Chinese president, paying about $40,000 a head. I mean, shouldn't Americans be concerned that that we're so intertwined with the Chinese economy and the Chinese government?
Yes, and we can decouple, though people say we can't. We didn't have an economy that was intertwined with China. We, through political decisions, made it so. We can adopt other political decisions to unwind what we did, and we absolutely have to, because it is both morally and strategically wrong to enrich a regime that considers us an enemy, has been killing Americans with COVID and with fentanyl, and which declared a people's war on us, which, although we're Americans and we think propaganda is not important, it's important to the Chinese. And so we have to understand the maliciousness and the malign nature of this regime, and we got to defend ourselves, and the Biden administration is not doing it.
And you mentioned propaganda. I think it's important for especially our viewers to understand how massive is their propaganda campaign against the U.S. and basically infiltrating not only the minds of our youth, but really just shaping and creating this division within America.
Yeah, no government maintains a larger propaganda apparatus than China. It just dwarfs everybody. And we see this with their television, with their radio, with their print. And as you point out, they've infiltrated America. They've done this over the course of decades. Just to give you an example of how effective they've been, we talk about Eric Swalwell, the representative from California. The Chinese Ministry of State Security didn't first contact him when he was on the House Intelligence Committee, where he would be obviously of value to China. They first contacted him when he was on the city council in Dublin City, California.
I didn't know.
Now, this is not to say that Swalwell is a traitor, because if everybody who was contacted by the MSS, that would be nobody in Congress left over. But the point is, it shows you how pervasive and how thorough and how determined China is to turn Americans against our own country, because there can't be just one Swalwell. There must be hundreds, if not thousands, in our country that the Ministry of State Security and Chinese diplomats have tried to recruit and turn.
Wow.
Gordon Chang, we look forward to spending time with you in Tokyo. We appreciate your important voice out there. Thanks for everything you do for CPAC. And let's go have a very, very interesting exchange in Asia, and we'll come back to you with the lessons we've learned.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.